Theodore. He's a tugboat and a friendly tugboat too. A friendly tugboat too. Oh, Theodore likes to do the things that friendly tugboats do. Pushing and a pulling in the great big harbor, in the great big world is so much fun. So many brand new things to discover. Waking with the sun, gotta get the job done. Oh, Theodore and Emily, Bodak, Hank and George, and the harbor master too.
The giant oil rig had arrived in the middle of the night, back from a job way out on the ocean. Theodore didn't know much about oil rigs, and he found them a little frightening. They were so big, so tall, so completely different from any vessels he'd ever seen here in the Big Harbor. But George laughed and told him not to worry.
Those rigs are big, all right, he said. But don't worry. I know them well. They all ask for me when they come in here. George, I want you to move that oil rig closer to the shore, announced the dispatcher. And take Theodore along with you.
Right away, Theodore began to worry. That oil rig looked awfully big, and George could be touchy about towing George's way. He was worried he'd make a mistake and then George would lose his temper. Maybe a bigger tug would be better, he said, trying to use his most helpful voice.
Follow me, Theodore, said George. I'll show you everything you need to know about oil rigs. Just don't get in the way.
Well, given the size of the oil rig, I don't really blame Theodore for being frightened. I'd be pretty nervous myself if I didn't know anything about oil rigs. But there is something that does confuse me, though. If Theodore finds oil rigs frightening, wouldn't he have felt the same way with Owen and Bumper Buddies? Just a curious thought. Anyway, as Theodore and George arrive to tow the oil rig in, whose name is Tex, the mighty oil rig feels that he doesn't need any tugs to move him and begins to talk very rudely to George.
Now, what do you want?
Tex drawled. He had a deep, slow voice that didn't sound very friendly at all. It made Theodore even more uncomfortable than before.
Don't need no little tugs to move me, said Tex. I can do that just fine myself.
Well, George was silent. Theodore didn't know what to say either. I mean, this wasn't what he had expected at all. Finally, George spoke quietly.
Well, we'll stand by then. You can go home for all I care, said Tex. Silly little puffers. You're only in the way anyways.
Theodore wondered what he should do next. The giant rig was being very rude to George. Theodore didn't know if George was angry or sad.
Look out of the way,
snarled Tex, starting to move. Well, Theodore couldn't think about George anymore. He had to move fast before the big oil rig ran right into him.
And immediately, I don't like you, Tex. I don't think any of us do, for that matter. In fact, I wouldn't help anyone who spoke to me like that. So after the tugs arrive back at the Great Ocean Dock, Fodak floats up and is very curious to hear all about the oil rig.
Did he tell you lots of stories about the ocean?
Asked Fodak.
He was pretty tired, said George. Well, we figured we'd better let him get some rest. He wanted us to stay, but...
Theodore stared at George. Why, that wasn't true at all.
I guess George gave you a good lesson about moving oil rigs, eh, Theodore? Said Fodak.
Theodore didn't know what to say. I mean, after all, he never wanted to tell a lie, but if he told Fodak about how badly the oil rig had treated George, George was likely to get upset again. Said Theodore, well, I've certainly never met anyone like him before. That was true enough, thought Theodore sadly.
Oh, but what happened to that whole George always tells the truth nonsense? I hate to do this to you, George, but you sit on a throne of lies, my friend. But anyway, the dispatcher then reports that a storm is coming and assigns George to go and check Tex's anchor cables. As Theodore is off pulling Bobby Barge back to his dock, he notices George talking to Tex about the storm, and of course, Tex starts being rude again.
There's a big storm coming. Do you need any help with your anchors? Oh, you again? Said Tex, cutting off George. Why don't you just run along now? I don't need your help. I got more important things to do than chatter with every little tub who just floats on by. Tub? cried George. "I'm the strongest tugboat in the Big Harbor. When you go for your fill of oil, where do you think it comes from, huh? Comes from big fellas like me that stay out at sea all alone for months at a time in all kinds of weather. So I don't need some little tug and tow truck's help in this little old harbor now."
Well, George felt terrible. Ships and oil rigs were always happy to have him help them. Not Tex. And you know something? For a moment, George wondered if Tex was right. Maybe he wasn't a useful tugboat after all.
I can't even imagine what George must be feeling inside. To be belittled like that has gotta be awful. So a little while later, Theodore is sent to check that the barges are tied down safely when he then notices one of Tex's cables is worn and weak. If it broke in the storm, Tex could either be hurt or smash into other ships. Now, Theodore doesn't really want to talk to Tex after the way he treated George so poorly, but then quickly remembers that tugboats must help any ship, no matter what.
"Tex, you've got a worn anchor cable and we're gonna have a storm. Do you think it'll be okay?" "Listen, little puffer," replied Tex. "I rode out hurricanes on a wide open ocean on these here anchor cables. I bet you never even been out on ocean."
"Oh, no, I haven't, sir," admitted Theodore.
"Well, you just mind your own business then," drawled Tex.
Well, Theodore didn't like being spoken to that way. He was so upset, he just turned and headed for home. The wind was getting stronger and stronger. George was by himself when Theodore returned to the Great Ocean dock.
"I saw you talking to Tex out there,"
Said George, still grumpy.
"Oh, I suppose he's your friend now."
Well, that made Theodore sad. I mean, he'd only been trying to help, and now George seemed to be nasty to him.
Jesus, poor Theodore is just getting slammed on. First by Tex, who's even more of a jerk than he once was, and all because Theodore was just trying to help. And now by George, who really should not be jumping to conclusions. Anyway, the storm finally rolls in, and as expected, the cable snaps. George is then sent to put a new line on the big rig before he drifts out of control. But just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, all hell breaks loose.
With all the wind and waves, another one of Tex's anchor cables broke with a loud snap.
"Help!"
called George.
"Help! Theodore! Help!"
Theodore couldn't believe it. He thought George was angry with him, but now George was asking for his help. He went as fast as he could. Off in the distance, Benjamin Bridge loomed over the water.
"Quick!"
Yelled Tex. He was headed right for Benjamin. Of course, Benjamin couldn't move out of the way. If Tex wasn't stopped, there would be a terrible crash. Tex and George were swirling in the storm, getting closer and closer to Benjamin. Benjamin was getting scared. "Turn back! Turn back!" he yelled. Theodore quickly saw what he had to do.
"Oh no!" cried Tex. "I'm gonna crash!"
Theodore had his lines around the big legs of the rig in a flash. And then he went right underneath Tex. Well, a bigger tugboat wouldn't have fit under there. But Theodore is so small and fast and nimble, he pulled as hard as he had ever pulled before, trying to stop Tex from twirling around. Theodore could almost feel Benjamin behind him.
"Pull, little guy!"
cried Tex.
"Hurry!"
cried Benjamin. Theodore was pulling so hard, it was beginning to hurt. It was working. Tex had stopped moving. Now George could pull Tex in a straight line with all his might. George let out 3 mighty blasts of his horn, and 3 again.
"Good tugging, Theodore!"
he yelled. Theodore gave 3 happy toots in return.
"Well done, George,"
he said. And Benjamin Bridge was pretty happy too.
That is definitely the most intense scene we have ever seen in any episode this season. Kudos to the team for really pulling this scene off so amazingly. So after the storm dies down, Theodore and George tow Tex back to his original place, and the big rig does something that takes both tugs by quite surprise.
And thanks a bunch from up here, said Tex. Maybe sometimes I am a little too big for these here bumpers, continued the big rig. And now I know I'd have been just a bunch of rods and rails without both of you. You know, you're both big fellas to me, said Tex. This all reminds me of a little old story I heard one time down in the Gulf of Mexico.
And that concludes Theodore and the big oil rig. Well, this episode definitely closed things out with a bang. It's amazing, to say the least. Yes, I know this isn't exactly the last episode, it's apparently the first, but to me it makes absolutely no sense, especially where I believe this episode falls once again timeline-wise. Because of the certain things that were mentioned, I feel like this episode definitely came before ones like Bumper Buddies and Vegetable, as they're the only remaining of the season that only briefly mention oil rigs. Anyways, as for our story, I thought it was perfect. It's a great lesson to teach kids that it doesn't really matter how big or small you are, everyone needs help sometimes. And as for our characters, obviously I sympathize with both Theodore and George here. They were only trying to do their jobs and kept getting belittled by Tex. Which now viewers are introduced to Tex for the first time, and he definitely comes off being very unlikable throughout most of this episode. Sure, he has a redeeming moment, but me personally, that's not enough to save his character for me. I just don't really like him. The only thing I may actually like about his character is the Texan accent. That's it. And for the music, Graham really outdid himself. We hear one little ditty in and out of certain scenes like this, the more fast-paced Theodore theme, and of course the most suspenseful piece, the storm theme. Again, everything about this episode is amazing. Now, what do I think about Season 1 overall? Well, to be honest, I think it's just okay as a whole. There's a lot of hit and miss episodes for me. There are some that I would watch over and over again, but there are some that I would be more than happy to skip. My biggest complaint with the season is just the lack of continuity. Where these episodes are chronologically placed just doesn't make any sense. And the Season 1 models, well, they're not exactly my favorite, but at least I can tolerate them. They're just not really what I'm used to in a sense. But like I said, the season itself is just okay. It did have its good moments, but most of the episodes just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Now with Season 1 at a close, it's time to move on to Season 2. And our first episode up is Theodore's Whistle.